The bullet that grazed Caleb Thorne's shoulder in the winter of 1872 should have killed him, but instead, it only killed the part of him that knew how to live among people. He rode away from the mining camp outside Denver with blood seeping through his coat and a hollow space in his chest that had nothing to do with the wound. 3 men lay dead behind him, ambushers who thought a lone trapper would be easy prey for his furs and his gold. They were wrong, but being right about violence had stopped mattering to Caleb somewhere between the first body dropping and the third. He rode north into the mountains of Wyoming Territory, following animal trails that took him away from settlements, away from voices, away from the possibility of ever having to explain what the war had done to him or what survival had cost since. By the time he found the cabin, spring had thawed the high passes, but the darkness in his mind remained frozen solid. The structure sat in a meadow ringed by pine forests, abandoned by whoever built it but solid enough to keep out the weather. Caleb claimed it without ceremony, patching the roof and clearing out the debris left by animals. He lived there through the summer and into another winter, speaking to no one, seeing no one, trading his furs twice a year at a distant outpost, where the factor knew better than to attempt conversation with the massive, grim-faced man who appeared like a ghost and vanished just as quickly. The darkness became his constant companion. It sat with him by the fire on endless winter nights. It walked beside him through the forest when he checked his trap lines. It pressed down on his shoulders with a weight that made even breathing feel like effort. Some days he wondered why he bothered setting traps at all, why he bothered with food or fire or any of the small acts of survival. But his hands kept moving through the motions, his body kept going, even when his mind offered him nothing but empty gray space. Caleb stood 6 feet 4 inches tall with shoulders broad enough to block a doorway. His arms were corded with muscle from years of swinging axes and hauling trap lines through deep snow. His chest was a wall of strength that came from living hard in hard country. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, usually tied back with a leather cord, and a thick beard covered the lower half of his face. His eyes were the color of winter sky, pale gray blue, and they held all the warmth of that season too. He was 31 years old and felt ancient. The spring of 1875 arrived with unusual warmth. Caleb was repairing his corral fence when he heard the wagon. The sound stopped him mid-swing, his whole body going tense the way it did when he sensed predators near his camp. He had not heard a wagon in his meadow in the 3 years he had lived there. Had not heard any human sound at all except his own breathing and the occasional grunt of effort when he worked. The wagon came into view through the trees, pulled by 2 tired-looking mules. A man handled the reins with the careful attention of someone navigating unfamiliar territory. Beside him sat a woman in a faded blue dress and a bonnet that had seen better days. 2 children, a boy and a girl, peered out from the back of the wagon bed, their faces smudged with trail dust. Caleb watched them approach with his hand resting on the axe handle. Every instinct told him to disappear into the trees, to avoid this interaction entirely. But the meadow was his, the cabin was his, and he would not be driven from his own territory by travelers. The man pulled the wagon to a stop a respectful distance away. He was thin, probably in his late 20s, with the look of someone who had been sick recently. His skin had a grayish cast under the sunburn, and his movements were careful, pained. "Afternoon," the man called out. His voice was hoarse. "Name is Thomas Fletcher. This is my wife Sarah and our children. We are heading west to Oregon Territory. Our map showed a trail through this valley, but I think we got ourselves lost." Caleb said nothing. He stood motionless, knowing he made an intimidating picture with his size and his silence and the axe in his hands. Sarah Fletcher climbed down from the wagon without waiting for help. She moved with purpose, her skirts stirring up dust as she approached. She stopped a few yards away, close enough to speak normally, but far enough to respect his space. "Mister," she said, and her voice was steadier than her husband's, warmer too. "We have been traveling for 6 weeks. My husband is not well. I can see you value your privacy and we will not intrude on it, but if you could point us toward the nearest town, we would be grateful." Caleb looked at her properly then. She was younger than he first thought, probably not yet 25. Her face was sunburned and tired, but her eyes were sharp and brown and direct. She looked at him without flinching, taking in his size and his wildness without visible fear. Something about that straightforward gaze made him uncomfortable in a way threats never did. "Town is 2 days south," he said. His voice came out rough from disuse. "Trail is back the way you came, then east at the fork by the dead pine." "Thank you," Sarah said. She started to turn away, then stopped. "Forgive me for asking, but do you have water we could take? We have been rationing and the children are thirsty." Caleb jerked his head toward the creek that ran past his cabin. "Creek is clean. Fill your barrels." Thomas Fletcher climbed down from the wagon slowly, one hand pressed to his side. Up close, Caleb could see the sweat on the man's face despite the cool mountain air. Could see the way he held himself like someone with broken ribs or worse. "I appreciate your help," Thomas said. He took 2 steps toward the creek and his legs gave out. Sarah caught him before he hit the ground, but she was not big enough to hold him up. Caleb moved without thinking, crossing the distance in 3 long strides and catching Thomas Fletcher under the arms. The man was burning with fever. "How long has he been like this?" Caleb demanded. 3 days, Sarah said. Her voice stayed calm, but he could see the fear in her eyes now. "He took a fall from the wagon, hit his side on a rock. I thought it was just bruising, but the fever started yesterday." Caleb half carried, half dragged Thomas toward the cabin. "Get your children. Bring your wagon around." "We cannot impose on you," Sarah started to say. "Your husband has a bad infection. He needs to be in a bed, not bouncing around in a wagon. Get your children." Sarah hesitated only a moment before running back to the wagon. Caleb got Thomas inside and onto his own bed, the only bed in the single-room cabin. The man was muttering now, barely conscious. Caleb had seen enough fever in the war to know this was serious. By the time Sarah got the children inside, Caleb had a fire going and water heating. The children, the girl maybe 8 and the boy maybe 6, stood close to their mother and stared at him with wide eyes. He knew what they saw. A giant wild man in a dark cabin that probably smelled like furs and wood smoke and isolation. "I need to see the wound," Caleb said. Sarah nodded and moved to her husband's side. Together they got his shirt off. The bruising on Thomas's left side was extensive, spreading from his ribs down to his hip in shades of purple and yellow. But worse was the gash above his hip bone, maybe 3 inches long and clearly infected. Red streaks radiated from it like veins of poison. "I have some supplies," Sarah said. "I've been cleaning it, but nothing seems to help." "It needs to be opened and drained," Caleb said. He looked at the children. "They should not watch this." Sarah's face went pale, but she nodded. "Emma, take your brother outside. Stay near the cabin where I can hear you." "But Mama," the girl started. "Go, sweet girl, now." The children left reluctantly. Sarah turned back to Caleb with her jaw set. "What do you need me to do?" Caleb heated his knife in the fire and cleaned it with whiskey from his small supply. His hands remembered this work from the war, from field hospitals where screaming was constant and death was everywhere. The darkness in his mind stirred and pressed close, whispering that everyone he touched died, that he should send these people away before he added them to the count. He pushed the thoughts aside and focused on the task. Sarah held her husband down when Caleb cut, and to her credit, she did not flinch when the infection drained out in a rush of fluid that stank of rot. Caleb cleaned the wound thoroughly, packed it with moss and herbs he had gathered for his own potential injuries, and wrapped it tight with clean cloth torn from one of his spare shirts. "He needs to stay still for at least a week," Caleb said. "Maybe more. The fever should break in a day or 2 if the infection does not spread." "We can make camp outside," Sarah said. "We have a tent in the wagon." Caleb looked around his cabin. 1 room, maybe 20 feet square. His bed, a table, 2 chairs, a fireplace. No privacy, no space. Everything in him wanted to say yes, wanted them outside, wanted his solitude back. "Storm is coming," he said instead, because it was true. He could smell it in the air, feel it in the pressure behind his eyes. "Big one, probably tonight. You will stay here. We cannot take your bed. You are taking it. I will sleep on the floor." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, and he could see her measuring him, trying to figure out if he was dangerous, if she was putting her children at risk. Whatever she saw in his face must have satisfied her, because she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Thorne, Caleb Thorne." "Thank you, Mr. Thorne." The storm hit that night as predicted, a late spring blow that howled around the cabin and dumped rain in sheets. Caleb lay on the floor near the fire, listening to Thomas Fletcher's labored breathing from the bed, to the softer sounds of Sarah and her children bedded down in blankets near the far wall. He could not sleep. Having people in his space made his skin crawl with awareness. He kept starting awake, reaching for weapons, certain something was wrong. But nothing was wrong except that he was not alone anymore, and some part of him had forgotten how to tolerate that. By morning the storm had passed and Thomas's fever had broken. He woke confused but clear-eyed, and Sarah cried into her hands with relief. Caleb escaped outside as soon as he could, needing distance from the emotions that filled his small space like smoke. He found Emma and young Jack near the creek, throwing stones into the water. They froze when they saw him, and he nodded to them before going to check his trap line. He stayed out most of the day, only returning when the sun was setting because he knew they needed food and he had rabbits from his traps. Sarah was at his table when he entered. She had cleaned while he was gone. He could see that immediately. The cabin had not been this organized since he moved in. His furs were stacked neatly, his supplies arranged logically, his floor swept. She had even scrubbed the table. "I hope you do not mind," she said quickly, seeing his face. "I needed something to do with my hands, and the children needed to see me staying busy, staying normal." Caleb grunted and moved to the fireplace, hanging the rabbits to skin. Behind him, he heard Thomas cough and shift on the bed. "How much do we owe you?" Thomas asked. His voice was weak but rational. "For your help, for the use of your home." "Nothing. That is not right. You saved my life. You do not owe me anything." Caleb kept his back to the room, focusing on the familiar work of preparing the rabbits. "When you are strong enough to travel, you go, that is all." Sarah appeared at his elbow, and he startled. He had not heard her move. She had a way of being quiet that unnerved him. "At least let me help with supper," she said. "I'm a fair cook when I have ingredients." Caleb wanted to say no, wanted to maintain the walls he had built, but the words that came out were, "Fire needs more wood." She smiled, just a small upturn of her mouth, but it changed her whole face. "I can manage that too." Over the next 3 days, Thomas healed slowly but steadily. The infection did not return and the fever stayed away. He was able to sit up, then to stand for short periods, then to walk around the cabin with Sarah's support. The children lost some of their fear of Caleb, though they still kept their distance from the huge, silent man who came and went like a mountain cat. Sarah cooked. She could not seem to help herself. She took Caleb's simple supplies and made them into meals that actually tasted like something. She made biscuits from his flour, stew from his dried venison, greens from the plants she foraged near the cabin. She hummed while she worked, old songs that Caleb half remembered from before the war, before the darkness. On the 4th day, Caleb returned from his trap line to find Sarah outside the cabin with an armful of wildflowers. The meadow was full of them this time of year, whole fields of color that he never paid attention to. She had picked what looked like dozens, yellow and purple and white blooms that she was arranging with careful attention. "What are you doing?" he asked. She jumped, then laughed at herself. "You move too quietly for a man your size. I'm just trying to brighten things up a bit. I found a jar in your supplies that should work as a vase." "Why?" Sarah paused, really looking at him. "Because beauty matters, Mr. Thorne. Even out here. Maybe especially out here." He wanted to tell her beauty was pointless, that flowers would just die, that nothing should be brought into his dark space, but she was already moving past him into the cabin, and he found himself following. She set the jar on his table, the one she had scrubbed clean days ago. The flowers looked absurd there, too bright, too alive. They did not belong in this place any more than she and her family did. Caleb stared at them, something uncomfortable stirring in his chest. "There," Sarah said with satisfaction. "That is much better." Thomas was sitting up in bed looking stronger than he had since they arrived. "My wife believes flowers can fix anything," he said with fondness in his voice. "Not fix," Sarah corrected. "Just help us remember there is more to life than survival." That night, Caleb lay on the floor near the fire and found himself watching the flowers on the table. The firelight made them glow, golden and soft. He could not remember the last time he had looked at something just because it was pleasant. Could not remember caring about anything beyond the practical necessities of staying alive. The darkness in his mind felt different. Still there, still heavy, but maybe not quite as absolute. Like someone had opened a shutter in a sealed room and let in a crack of light. 5 days after the Fletchers arrived, Thomas announced he felt strong enough to travel. "We have taken advantage of your hospitality long enough," he said. "If you will help me hitch up the mules, we can be on our way by afternoon." Caleb should have felt relief, should have been eager to reclaim his solitude, his silence, his carefully maintained isolation. Instead, he felt something uncomfortably close to loss. "The trail will be muddy from the storm," he said. "Better to wait a few more days." "We have delayed our journey enough," Thomas replied. "Oregon will not wait, and we need to reach the Willamette Valley before winter." Sarah was packing their belongings back into the wagon, moving efficiently through tasks while Emma and Jack chased each other around the meadow. She had been quieter today, Caleb noticed. Less humming, less of that easy warmth she had shown over the past days. By mid-afternoon, the wagon was loaded. Thomas was pale but standing on his own. The children were in the wagon bed, waving shyly at Caleb. He stood by the cabin door, his arms crossed over his chest, his face carefully blank. Thomas extended his hand. "I cannot thank you enough, Mr. Thorne. You gave us shelter when we needed it most. You saved my life. If you ever need anything, if you are ever in Oregon, you look up Thomas Fletcher in the Willamette Valley." Caleb shook his hand, careful of his strength. "Travel safe." Sarah approached last. She stood before him, this small, determined woman who had invaded his space and cooked in his kitchen and put flowers on his table. Her brown eyes were serious. "You are a good man, Caleb Thorne," she said quietly. "I hope you remember that, whatever it is you are hiding from up here." His jaw tightened. "You do not know anything about me. I know you could have sent us away and you did not. I know you could have let my husband die and you saved him instead. I know you live alone in these mountains like you are punishing yourself for something." She reached out and touched his arm, just briefly. "Whatever happened to you, it does not mean you have to stay buried up here." Caleb had no answer for that. Sarah squeezed his arm once, then turned and climbed onto the wagon seat. Thomas snapped the reins and the mules started forward. The children called out goodbyes. Sarah looked back once, her hand raised in farewell. Then they were gone, the wagon disappearing into the trees, and Caleb stood alone in his meadow like he had for 3 years. He went inside. The cabin felt too big and too quiet. His bed was neatly made with blankets he did not remember owning, probably left by Sarah. The table was clean, the floor was swept, and in the center of the table, the wildflowers still sat in their jar, bright and impossible. Caleb stood there for a long time, just looking at them. That night, the darkness pressed in as it always did, whispering its familiar litany of worthlessness and death. But for the first time in years, Caleb pushed back. He found himself thinking about Sarah's words, about the way she had looked at him without fear or judgment, about how she had seen something in him worth thanking. The flowers lasted a week before they started to wilt. Caleb found himself checking them each day, noting when petals fell or stems drooped. When they finally died, he took them outside and scattered them in the meadow. Then he stood there looking at the empty jar on his table and felt the loss of something he could not name. 2 weeks passed. 3. Caleb worked his trap lines and tended his garden plot and repaired his equipment. But the rhythms that had sustained him for 3 years felt hollow now. He found himself listening for the sound of a wagon, for children's voices, for a woman humming while she cooked. His cabin felt less like a refuge and more like a cell. One morning, he woke to find himself staring at the empty jar and realized he was angry. Angry at Sarah Fletcher for making him notice the emptiness, angry at himself for caring, angry at the flowers for dying, angry at the darkness in his mind for lifting just enough to show him what he had been missing. He grabbed the jar and threw it. It shattered against the stone fireplace, shards scattering across the floor. Then, he stood there breathing hard, feeling foolish and raw, and more alive than he had in years. The anger passed, leaving exhaustion behind. Caleb cleaned up the broken glass carefully, cutting his thumb in the process. He watched the blood well up, red and real, and thought about Sarah saying beauty mattered. Thought about her putting flowers on his table like it was the most natural thing in the world. Maybe she was right. Maybe he had been punishing himself, hiding from life because living hurt too much. The war had taken so much from him. The years after had taken more. He had lost friends, lost faith, lost any sense of purpose beyond basic survival. Coming to these mountains had felt like mercy, like giving up in a way that did not require a bullet. But Sarah had looked at him and seen a good man. Her children had started to trust him. Thomas had shaken his hand with genuine gratitude. They had brought light into his darkness without even trying, just by being human and vulnerable and present. Caleb looked around his empty cabin and made a decision. He spent the next week preparing. He packed his most valuable furs, his tools, his supplies. He built a cache to protect what he could not carry and marked it carefully so he could find it again if he returned. He had no clear plan beyond following the trail the Fletchers had taken, beyond seeing if he could find them before they reached Oregon, beyond maybe asking if they needed an extra hand on their journey. It was foolish. They had probably reached settlements by now, found wagons heading west, joined up with other families. They would have no need for a mountain man who barely knew how to speak to people. But Caleb packed anyway, driven by something he could not quite name but also could not ignore. On his last night in the cabin, he stood at the door and looked out at the meadow. The wildflowers were still blooming, spreading color across the grass in the moonlight. He thought about how many times he had looked at this view without really seeing it, how he had trained himself not to notice beauty or hope or possibility. "Thank you," he said quietly to the empty air, to the memory of Sarah Fletcher putting flowers on his table. Then he closed the door and walked away from the darkness. The trail south was easier than he expected. Caleb traveled fast, unencumbered by a wagon or family. He followed the marks left by the Fletchers' wheels, signs that were fading but still visible to someone who knew how to track. After 2 days, he reached the town he had directed them toward, a rough collection of buildings that served trappers and traders passing through. The factor at the trading post remembered them. Family with 2 kids? Yeah, they came through. Stayed a few days while the husband recovered his strength, left about 10 days ago heading west to catch the main Oregon Trail at Fort Bridger. They seemed well? Well enough. The woman asked after you, actually. Asked if anyone knew a man named Caleb Thorne living in the mountains. Seemed worried about you. The factor gave him a curious look. That is you, I take it? It is. Well, she's a good woman to worry. She left something for you, in case you came through. The factor went into the back room and returned with a small package wrapped in cloth. Caleb took it with confused hands, feeling the light weight of it. He unwrapped it outside, sitting on the steps of the trading post. Inside was a small book, well worn, and a note in neat handwriting. The note read, "Mr. Thorne, I do not know if you will ever see this, but I wanted to leave something in case you did. This is my book of pressed flowers. I've been collecting them since I was a girl. Every flower reminds me that the world has beauty even in hard times. I want you to have it because I think you need that reminder more than I do. You gave us shelter and saved my husband's life. This is a poor payment, but it is what I have to give. Remember the flowers, Caleb. Sarah Fletcher." Caleb opened the book with careful hands. Every page held pressed flowers, dozens of them, carefully preserved with their names written beneath in Sarah's handwriting. Wildflowers, garden flowers, flowers he did not recognize. Years of collection, years of choosing to notice beauty, given away to a stranger because she thought he needed it. Something cracked in his chest, something that had been frozen solid for years. He sat on those steps with tears running into his beard and felt the darkness fracture and begin to break apart. He stayed in town one night, buying supplies and asking questions about the Oregon Trail. Fort Bridger was 2 weeks' travel west. From there, wagon trains departed regularly through the summer, following the route that thousands had taken before. If he pushed hard, he might catch the Fletchers before they joined a train, or at least before they got too far ahead. Caleb rode out at dawn, carrying Sarah's book in the pack closest to his heart. The journey to Fort Bridger took him through country he had not seen in years. Rolling plains, river valleys, the gradual descent from high mountains to prairie. He passed other travelers, most heading west with that same mix of hope and desperation that had driven thousands to risk everything on new land. He kept to himself mostly, but he no longer felt the need to hide from every human presence. At night, he read Sarah's book by firelight, studying the pressed flowers in her careful notes. Columbine from the mountain meadow near her childhood home, Rose from her mother's garden, Daisy from the field where Thomas proposed. Each flower had a story, a moment of beauty captured and preserved. He started to understand what she had been trying to tell him with the vase on his table. Fort Bridger was a chaos of wagons and people when Caleb arrived. The fort itself was a trading post and way station, surrounded by the temporary camps of dozens of families preparing for the westward journey. Caleb moved through the crowds, asking about the Fletchers, describing Sarah and Thomas and the children. He found them 2 days later. Their wagon was parked on the edge of a large encampment, part of a train that was preparing to leave within the week. Emma and Jack were playing with other children nearby. Thomas was working on a wagon wheel, looking healthier than when Caleb had last seen him. And Sarah was hanging laundry on a line stretched between her wagon and a neighboring one. Caleb stood at a distance, suddenly uncertain. What was he doing here? What did he expect to happen? They had their own lives, their own journey. He was a mountain man who barely knew how to exist around people. He should turn around and go back to his solitude before he made a fool of himself. Then Sarah turned and saw him. Her face went through several expressions in quick succession: surprise, confusion, and then something that looked like joy. She dropped the shirt she was holding and started walking toward him, her pace quickening with each step until she was almost running. "Caleb," she called. "Caleb Thorne, is that really you?" He stood frozen as she approached, this small woman with her sunburned face and determined eyes who had put flowers on his table and left him her most precious book. "It is me," he said. Sarah stopped a few feet away, slightly breathless. Up close, he could see the happiness in her face, genuine and unguarded. "What are you doing here? Is everything all right? Did something happen to your cabin?" "The cabin is fine. I came to find you." "You came all this way?" Her eyes widened. "Why?" Caleb opened his pack and pulled out her book. "To return this, and to say thank you." Sarah took the book with gentle hands, holding it like the treasure it was. "You got my note." "I did. I cannot accept this. It means too much to you." "I gave it to you because it means something," Sarah said softly. "Because I hoped it might help, the way you helped us." It did. The words came hard, but Caleb forced them out. "I have been hiding in those mountains for 3 years, hiding from everything. Then you put flowers on my table and something changed. I could not stop thinking about them, about what you said about beauty mattering, about how I have been more dead than alive since the war ended." Sarah's expression shifted to understanding, to compassion. "You're not hiding anymore. I do not want to be. I do not know how to do anything else, but I want to try." "That is a start," Sarah said. She looked back toward her wagon where Thomas had noticed the newcomer and was walking over. "Thomas, look who has found us." Thomas Fletcher's face split into a genuine smile when he recognized Caleb. "Mr. Thorne, this is a surprise. What brings you down from your mountain?" Caleb glanced at Sarah, then back to Thomas. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted. "I think I needed to see that you made it safely. Needed to know I could leave that place." "Well, you are welcome here any time," Thomas said, extending his hand. "Are you heading west yourself?" I had not thought that far ahead. Sarah exchanged a look with her husband, some silent communication passing between them. Then she turned back to Caleb with that direct gaze he remembered. "Our wagon train needs scouts," she said. "Men who know the country, who can hunt and track and keep watch. The wagon master is hiring. You would be perfect for it. I do not know the Oregon Trail, but you know mountains and rivers and how to read country. You know how to survive. That is what matters." Sarah stepped closer, lowering her voice. "We would feel safer with you along, Caleb. I would feel safer." Something in the way she said his name made his heart beat faster. He looked at Thomas, expecting to see jealousy or suspicion, but the man just nodded agreement. "She is right. We would be glad of your company and your skills. The trail is dangerous. Having someone like you watching over the train would be a blessing." Caleb wanted to say no, wanted to point out all the reasons it was a bad idea for him to join a wagon train full of families and children and normal people living normal lives. But the darkness in his mind, which had ruled him for so long, was cracking apart like spring ice on a river. In the spaces between the shadows, light was getting in. "I will talk to your wagon master," he said. The wagon master was a grizzled man named Peterson, who had made the journey to Oregon 3 times already. He looked Caleb up and down, taking in his size, his weapons, the way he carried himself. "You have military experience?" Peterson asked. "I was in the war, Union cavalry." "Can you shoot?" "Yes." "Can you track?" "I've been trapping in the high country for 3 years. I can track." "Can you take orders even when you disagree with them?" That question was harder. Caleb considered it honestly. "I can if the orders make sense and do not put people in danger unnecessarily." Peterson snorted. "Fair enough. I'm not looking for blind obedience, just someone who will not undercut my authority when we need to move fast. We have 63 people in 22 wagons, families with children mostly, a few single men, 1 older couple. We are already running late in the season. I need scouts who can find good water, good grazing, and warn us about trouble before we ride into it. Pay is $50 if we make it to Oregon City, plus meals from the common pot. Interested?" $50 was more money than Caleb had seen in one place in years. "I am interested." "Good. We leave in 4 days. Be ready at dawn or we go without you." Caleb spent those 4 days making himself useful around the wagon camp. He helped families repair equipment, taught some of the men how to properly care for their firearms, and scouted the immediate area to get a sense of the country ahead. The other scouts, 2 brothers named Frank and Henry Miller, accepted him with minimal fuss once they saw he knew what he was doing. The children of the wagon train were fascinated by him. They had never seen anyone quite so large or quite so wild-looking. Emma and Jack introduced him proudly as Mr. Thorne, who saved our papa, which gave him more credit than he deserved, but also made the other families trust him. Caleb found himself uncomfortable with the attention, but not as panicked by it as he would have been a month ago. Sarah was a constant presence, though she seemed careful not to monopolize his time. She would bring him coffee when he was working on wagons, would make sure he ate from the common pot at mealtimes, would sometimes just sit nearby with her mending while he worked, not talking, just being present. Caleb found her presence soothing in a way he could not explain. On the night before the train was to depart, Caleb took a walk to clear his head. He found himself at the edge of camp, looking west toward the mountains that stood between here and Oregon. Somewhere on the other side of those peaks was new country, new possibilities. The thought terrified and thrilled him in equal measure. "Big thoughts?" Sarah's voice came from behind him. He turned to find her approaching with 2 tin cups. She handed him one, and he discovered it held coffee, still hot. "Just thinking about what comes next," he said. "Scared?" she asked, settling onto a rock nearby. "Terrified." "Good. That means you are alive." She sipped her coffee, looking out at the same view he had been contemplating. "I am terrified, too. Oregon is so far away. We are risking everything on the chance it will be better there. Some days I think we are insane." "Why go then?" "Because staying felt like dying slowly. Thomas worked in a mill in Pennsylvania. The air was bad, the pay was worse. He was coughing all the time, getting thinner. The children barely saw him. We were surviving but not living." She glanced at him. "I think you understand the difference." Caleb did. He sat down on another rock, close enough to talk comfortably but maintaining respectful distance. "I have been surviving for a long time. I forgot what living felt like until you put flowers on my table." Sarah smiled. "Those flowers really meant something to you." "They meant everything. They were the first beautiful thing I let myself notice in 3 years." He pulled out her book from his coat pocket. "I need you to take this back. It is too precious to risk on the trail." "No." Sarah pushed it back toward him. "I gave it to you because you need it more than I do. I can always collect more flowers, Caleb, but you need to remember that beauty exists. Promise me you will keep it." He held the book, feeling the weight of her gift, her faith in him. "I promise." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, drinking their coffee and watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple. Caleb felt something unfamiliar stirring in his chest, something warm and alive that had nothing to do with the coffee. "Can I ask what happened to you?" Sarah said quietly. "During the war." Caleb's first instinct was to shut down, to refuse the question, but he had promised himself he would try to live again, and living meant letting people in sometimes. "I was at Shiloh," he said, "among other places, but Shiloh was the worst. 2 days of battle that felt like 2 years. By the end, I could not tell whose bodies I was stepping over, could not tell if the screaming was the wounded or myself." He stopped, his hands tightening on the cup. "I survived when better men died, lost friends, lost any sense that the world made sense. After the war, I tried to go home, but I did not fit anywhere anymore. The darkness just kept getting heavier until I could not carry it around people." Sarah reached over and put her hand on his arm. The touch was gentle, grounding. "You carry it well for someone so burdened." "I do not feel like I carry it well. You helped us when you did not have to. You saved Thomas. You were trying to live again instead of just hiding. That is carrying it well, Caleb." He looked at her hand on his arm, small and capable against his scarred, calloused skin. "Why do you care? You barely know me." "I know enough," Sarah said. "I know you are a good man trying to find his way back. That is worth caring about." Something shifted in that moment, something fundamental. Caleb felt it like a physical sensation, like the last of a winter ice breaking up in his chest. He turned his hand and caught Sarah's, holding it gently. "Thank you," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "for seeing something in me I could not see in myself." Sarah squeezed his hand and did not let go. They sat there as the sun set completely and stars began to appear. Two people who had found each other by accident and were discovering it might not be an accident at all. The wagon train departed at dawn 4 days later, 22 wagons rolling west in a line that stretched across the prairie. Caleb rode ahead with Frank and Henry Miller, ranging a mile or more in front of the train to scout the route and watch for hazards. It felt good to have purpose again, to use his skills for something beyond simple survival. The Oregon Trail was well established by 1875, worn deep by the thousands of wagons that had preceded them. But it was still dangerous. Rivers had to be forded, mountains climbed, supplies rationed carefully. Peterson drove them hard, knowing they were late in the season and had to cover significant ground before the mountain passes became snowbound. Caleb fell into the rhythms of the trail. He rode out before dawn, scouted the day's route, hunted when he could, and returned to camp each evening to report to Peterson. The other families grew accustomed to him, stopped seeing him as the scary mountain man, and started treating him as a valuable member of their company. Children waved when he rode past, men asked his advice, women saved him portions of their cooking. But it was Sarah he looked for at the end of each day. Sarah who would have coffee ready when he rode into camp. Sarah who would ask about what he had seen, who would tell him stories about her day, who would sometimes walk with him at the edge of camp when the work was done. Thomas noticed, of course. 3 weeks into the journey, he pulled Caleb aside one evening. "I need to speak with you," Thomas said, his voice serious. Caleb's stomach tightened. Here it was, the confrontation he had been waiting for. Thomas was going to tell him to stay away from Sarah, to stop spending time with her, to remember she was a married woman. They walked away from camp until they had privacy. Thomas was quiet for a long moment, then turned to face Caleb directly. "My wife cares for you," Thomas said. Caleb's jaw tightened. "I have done nothing improper. I have been respectful." "I know, that is not what I'm trying to say." Thomas sighed and ran a hand through his hair. "This is harder than I thought. Let me start over. Sarah and I have been married for 9 years. We married young, probably too young. We care for each other. We have built a life together, had children together. But we are not in love. Maybe we never were." Caleb stared at him, not understanding where this was going. Thomas continued, "We are partners more than we are husband and wife. Good partners, good parents, but there is no passion there, no romance. I think we both knew it. But we stayed together because it was safe, because we had the children, Because it was easier than admitting we made a mistake. Why are you telling me this? Caleb asked. Because Sarah looks at you the way I wish she looked at me, Thomas said simply. Because I see her come alive when you are around in a way I have never seen in all our years together. And because I am dying. The words hit Caleb like a physical blow. What? Thomas sat down on a rock, suddenly looking much older than his 28 years. The accident I had, the one that gave me the infection, it was not the first time I fell. I've been getting weaker for over a year. Dizzy spells, weakness in my limbs, pains in my chest. I saw a doctor in Pennsylvania before we left. He said I have a growth in my brain, that it will keep getting worse until I cannot walk or speak or care for myself, that I have maybe 2 years, probably less. Caleb sat down heavily. Does Sarah know? She knows I am sick. She does not know how bad it is. I have not had the courage to tell her. Thomas looked at him with desperate eyes. I'm bringing her to Oregon because I want her and the children to have land, to have a future. I want to build them a home before I cannot anymore, and I want to know they will not be alone when I am gone. Understanding crashed over Caleb like cold water. You want me to take care of them. I want you to love them, Thomas corrected, the way I should have but never quite managed. Sarah deserves to be loved with passion, with devotion. She deserves someone who looks at her the way you do, and the children deserve a father who will be there as they grow up. I cannot do that, Caleb said, his voice harsh. I cannot take another man's wife. I cannot build a life on your death. You are not taking her. I am giving her to you because I love her enough to want her to be happy. Thomas stood up, swaying slightly. I do not expect you to understand. I barely understand it myself. But I am asking you, man to man, to be there for them. Court Sarah if she will have you. Show her there is more to life than duty and survival. And when I am gone, marry her. Give my children your name and your protection. This is insane, Caleb said, but his voice lacked conviction, because part of him, the part that had been waking up since Sarah put flowers on his table, wanted exactly what Thomas was describing. Maybe, Thomas agreed, but we are living in insane times, and sometimes the right thing looks crazy from the outside. Just think about it. That is all I ask. Thomas walked back toward camp, leaving Caleb sitting alone in the gathering dark. His mind spun with the implications of what he had just heard. Thomas was dying. Sarah did not know how bad it was, and Thomas wanted him to step in, to take his place, to love his wife and raise his children. It was the most selfless and most bizarre thing anyone had ever asked of him. Caleb stayed out late that night, wrestling with his thoughts. Part of him wanted to run, to disappear back into the mountains where things were simple and he did not have to deal with complicated emotions. But another part, the part that had been growing stronger since he left his cabin, wanted to stay, wanted to know Sarah better, wanted to see where these feelings might lead. By the time he returned to camp, he had made no decisions except to keep going, to stay with the train, to see what happened. The wagon train rolled on across Wyoming territory. They forded the Green River, climbed into the high country, and descended into the valley beyond. Caleb threw himself into his work, ranging far ahead to scout the route and hunt for game. He was gone more than the other scouts, and he knew people noticed, but he needed the space to think. Sarah noticed too. One evening, about a week after Thomas's revelation, she found Caleb at the edge of camp where he was cleaning his rifle. "You have been avoiding me," she said without preamble. "I have been working. You have been running away." She sat down beside him uninvited. "Did Thomas say something to you?" Caleb's hands stilled on the rifle. "Why would you think that?" "Because you were spending time with me every evening and then suddenly you stopped. And Thomas has been acting strange, watching us with this sad, hopeful expression. So I am asking, what did my husband say to you?" Caleb set down the rifle and looked at her. Really looked at her. She was sunburned and trail-worn, her dress dusty, her hands rough from work. She was also beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with conventional prettiness and everything to do with strength and determination and vitality. "He told me he cares about you," Caleb said carefully, "that he wants you to be happy." Sarah's eyes searched his face. "That's not all," he said. No, Caleb took a breath. He told me he sees how you look at me, and he asked me to care for you and the children. Color rose in Sarah's cheeks, but she did not look away. And what did you say? I did not know what to say. You are married to him. I am married to him, Sarah agreed, but I do not love him the way a wife should love a husband. I respect him. I care for him. But there is no passion there, Caleb. There never has been. We married young because it seemed practical, and we have built a good partnership. But it is not a great love. That does not make it right for me to step between you. You are not stepping between us. You are offering something different. Sarah reached out and took his hand, her touch deliberate. I do not know what Thomas told you, if there is more he is keeping from me. But I do know that when I look at you, I feel alive in a way I have never felt before. You make me want to laugh and cry and live fully. That is worth acknowledging, even if it is complicated. Caleb turned his hand and laced his fingers through hers. I have been dead inside for so long. You brought me back to life with a vase of wildflowers. I do not know how to do this, Sarah. I do not know how to care for someone without failing them. Then we will figure it out together, she said softly. No promises, no expectations, just two people trying to live instead of just survive. He pulled her closer until their shoulders were touching. They sat that way as the sun set, hands intertwined, two damaged people finding comfort in each other's presence. Over the following weeks, Caleb and Sarah grew closer. They were careful to be respectful, to avoid scandal, but they stopped pretending there was nothing between them. They walked together in the evenings. They talked about their pasts, their hopes, their fears. Sarah told him about growing up in Pennsylvania, about marrying Thomas at 16, about learning to be a mother before she knew how to be a wife. Caleb told her about the war, about the darkness that had consumed him after, about the 3 years of isolation in the mountains. Thomas watched it all with his sad, hopeful expression, encouraging them in small ways, giving them time together. He grew visibly weaker as the journey continued. More dizzy spells, more times when he had to lie down in the wagon, more mornings when Sarah had to help him stand. The other families noticed and offered help, driving the Fletcher wagon when Thomas could not, watching the children so Sarah could rest. Caleb found himself becoming deeply involved in the family's daily life. He taught Jack how to fish in the streams they passed. He showed Emma how to identify animal tracks. He repaired their wagon, hunted for their pot, and sat with Thomas when the man needed company, but Sarah needed a break. One night, about 6 weeks into the journey, Thomas had a bad spell. Caleb was nearby when it happened, close enough to hear Sarah's cry of alarm. He ran to their wagon to find Thomas on the ground, convulsing, his eyes rolled back. "What do I do?" Sarah cried, trying to hold her husband still. "Keep him from hitting his head," Caleb said, dropping down beside her. He had seen this before, soldiers having fits after head wounds. "It will pass. Just keep him safe." They held Thomas together while the seizure ran its course. Emma and Jack watched from the wagon, terrified. The other families gathered, offering prayers and assistance. After what felt like forever but was probably only a minute, Thomas went still. He lay gasping for breath, his face pale and sweaty. "Inside the wagon," Caleb said. He lifted Thomas as easily as if the man weighed nothing, carried him into the wagon and laid him on the bed. Sarah climbed in after them, her face stricken. "This has happened before," she said. It was not a question. Thomas looked at her with tears in his eyes. "Yes. How long have you been hiding this from me?" "Since before we left Pennsylvania." Thomas reached for her hand. "Sarah, I need to tell you something. I should have told you long ago." Caleb started to leave, to give them privacy, but Thomas stopped him. "No, stay. You need to hear this too." So Caleb stood in the cramped wagon while Thomas finally told his wife the truth. About the doctor's diagnosis, about the brain growth, about the prognosis of 2 years at most. Sarah listened with tears streaming down her face, her hand gripping Thomas's so hard her knuckles were white. "Why did you not tell me?" she whispered when he finished. "Because I wanted you to have hope. I wanted to give you and the children a future in Oregon before you had to face losing me. I wanted to be strong for you, just a little longer." Thomas looked at Caleb. "And I wanted to find someone who could love you the way you deserve to be loved." Sarah followed his gaze to Caleb, understanding dawning on her face. Thomas, you did not— I did. I asked Caleb to care for you when I'm gone, to marry you, to be a father to Emma and Jack, to give you a life of passion and joy, not just duty. You have no right to arrange my life like that, Sarah said, but her voice was gentle, not angry. I know, but I love you enough to try anyway. Thomas smiled weakly. You deserve to be cherished, Sarah. You deserve someone who will look at you the way Caleb does, and our children deserve a father who will be there as they grow up. Sarah turned to look at Caleb, her eyes full of questions and tears and something that might have been hope. And what do you think about this arrangement? Caleb stepped closer until he was kneeling beside the bed. I think your husband is a better man than most. I think he loves you more than I understood. And I think I have been falling in love with you since you put wildflowers on my table. Sarah's breath caught. You love me? I'm learning how. I do not know if I am doing it right, but when I think about the future, you are in it. You and Emma and Jack and Thomas, for as long as he is with us. Sarah looked between the two men, her husband who was giving her away, and the mountain man who was trying to learn to love. Then she started to laugh, a slightly hysterical sound that was half sob. This is the strangest courtship in the history of courtships, she said. Probably, Thomas agreed, but it is ours. They stayed in camp an extra day to let Thomas recover. Caleb hunted and brought back an elk, providing meat for the whole train. Sarah tended to her husband and her children, processing what she had learned. Caleb gave her space but made sure she knew he was there if she needed him. That evening, Sarah found him sitting by his campfire, staring into the flames. May I join you? She asked. Always. She settled beside him, close enough that their arms touched. For a long while they sat in silence, listening to the night sounds of the camp. I am angry with him, Sarah finally said, for keeping this from me, for trying to arrange my future without asking me first. You have a right to be angry. But I also understand why he did it. He was trying to protect me in the only way he knew how. She turned to look at Caleb. I need to know something. Are you interested in me because Thomas asked you to be, or because you genuinely care? Caleb met her eyes. Thomas's request made me think about possibilities I'd been avoiding. But my feelings for you are not about duty or obligation. You made me want to live again. You saw good in me when I could not see it myself. You put flowers on my table and cracked open the darkness that had been drowning me. I would want you even if Thomas had never said a word. Sarah's eyes glistened with tears. I care for you too. More than I should, maybe. Given that my husband is still alive, but I cannot help how I feel. Thomas knows. He approves. I know. That almost makes it harder. She wiped at her eyes. How do we do this, Caleb? How do we love each other while Thomas is dying? How do I honor my marriage while also accepting that it was never a true love match? How do we build something new on top of something ending? I do not know, Caleb admitted. I only know I want to try. We will figure it out as we go, all three of us. We will do right by Thomas and by each other and by the children. Sarah leaned her head against his shoulder, and Caleb put his arm around her. They sat that way until late in the night, drawing comfort from each other's presence, preparing for the complicated road ahead. The wagon train pushed on toward Oregon. They climbed through mountain passes where snow still lingered in the shadows. They descended into valleys where wildflowers bloomed in impossible profusion. They forded rivers and crossed plains and slowly, steadily moved west. Thomas had more seizures. He grew weaker, needed more help with daily tasks, but he also seemed lighter somehow, as if telling the truth had lifted a weight from him. He smiled more, laughed with his children, spent long hours talking with Sarah about their memories and their hopes for the future. Caleb became an unofficial part of the Fletcher family. He drove their wagon when Thomas could not. He lifted heavy loads, made repairs, hunted for their meals. Emma and Jack started calling him Uncle Caleb without anyone telling them to. He taught them skills, told them stories, and found himself becoming deeply attached to these children who had never asked for any of this. Sarah bloomed on the trail despite the hardships, or perhaps because of them. She seemed more alive than Caleb had ever seen her, laughing more, singing while she worked, finding joy in small moments. She collected wildflowers wherever they stopped, pressing them between pages of books, creating new memories to replace the collection she had given away. One evening, after the children were asleep and Thomas was resting in the wagon, Sarah and Caleb walked out into a meadow full of lupine. The purple flowers stretched in every direction, glowing in the twilight. "It is beautiful," Sarah breathed. "Yes," Caleb agreed, but he was looking at her, not the flowers. She caught his gaze and smiled. "You are looking at me, not the meadow." "The meadow is beautiful. You are extraordinary." Sarah's cheeks flushed. "Caleb Thorne, are you flirting with me?" "I'm trying. I'm not very good at it." "You're doing just fine." She reached for his hand, lacing their fingers together. "Dance with me." "There is no music." "Then hum something." Caleb could not remember the last time he had danced, could not remember the last time he had done anything purely for joy. But he started humming an old tune from before the war, and Sarah swayed into his arms. They moved slowly across the meadow, stepping carefully around the flowers, two people learning to be happy together. "This is what life should feel like," Sarah whispered against his chest. "This moment, right here." Caleb held her closer, breathing in the scent of wildflowers in Sarah's hair, feeling more content than he had in years. The darkness that had ruled his mind for so long was almost entirely gone, replaced by this warmth, this connection, this growing love. When they returned to camp, Thomas was sitting outside the wagon watching the stars. He smiled when he saw them together, their hands still joined. "You two look happy," he said. "We are," Sarah replied. She sat beside her husband and took his hand too. "Thank you for this, Thomas, for being generous enough to let me find joy even while you are suffering." "Your joy does not diminish my suffering," Thomas said. "It makes it bearable. Knowing you will be cared for, that the children will have a father, that you will have love, that is the only thing that gives me peace." Caleb sat on Thomas's other side, the three of them forming a strange little circle. "You are a remarkable man, Thomas Fletcher. I'm a dying man trying to do one good thing before I go." Thomas squeezed both their hands. "Promise me something. Promise me you will be happy, that you will not waste time grieving me too long, that you will build a good life in Oregon." "We promise," Sarah said, tears streaming down her face. "Good. That is good." Thomas leaned back, looking up at the stars. "It is a beautiful night." They sat together until Thomas grew tired, then helped him into the wagon. Caleb walked Sarah to her bedroll, said good night, and returned to his own camp. He lay awake for a long time, thinking about the strange turns life could take, about how love could grow in the most unexpected places. The wagon train reached Fort Hall in late July, the halfway point of their journey. They rested for a few days, trading for supplies and making repairs. Thomas had a particularly bad day, unable to leave the wagon at all, and Peterson quietly asked Caleb if the family would be able to continue. "They will continue," Caleb said firmly. "I will make sure of it." Peterson nodded, trusting him. "You are good with them, with the woman and the children. You planning on making that permanent?" "If she will have me." "She will," Peterson said with certainty. "Anyone with eyes can see how she looks at you." They left Fort Hall and pushed into the mountains of Idaho Territory. The trail grew more difficult, the climb steeper, the air thinner. Thomas grew worse, sleeping most of each day, barely able to eat. Sarah tended him with devoted care, but Caleb could see the strain wearing on her. One evening, Caleb took over sitting with Thomas so Sarah could rest. The man was awake but barely, his eyes unfocused. "Caleb," Thomas whispered, "I am here. I do not have much time left." "Do not talk like that. You're going to make it to Oregon." Thomas smiled faintly. Maybe not. But I need to say this while I can. Take care of her. Love her. Give my children your name and your protection. Be the man I wish I could have been." "You are already that man," Caleb said roughly. "What you are doing, giving her permission to love again, to be happy, that takes more strength than anything I have ever done. Promise me." "I promise. I will love her and care for them. I will be the best man I can be for them." "Good. That is all I needed to hear." Thomas closed his eyes, exhausted. Thank you, my friend, for giving me peace. Caleb sat with him through the night, keeping watch, making sure Thomas was never alone. Thomas Fletcher died 3 days later, on a morning when the sunrise painted the mountains gold and purple. He slipped away quietly, Sarah holding one hand and Caleb holding the other, Emma and Jack saying their goodbyes. He was 38 years old, and he died knowing his family would be cared for. They buried him on a hillside overlooking a valley full of wildflowers. The whole wagon train stopped for the funeral, and Peterson said words over the grave. Sarah stood dry-eyed and strong, her children pressed against her sides, while Caleb stood slightly behind, a silent support. After the funeral, Sarah came to Caleb's camp. She looked exhausted and heartbroken, but also, somehow, at peace. "He's gone," she said quietly. "I am sorry." "So am I, but he is not suffering anymore. He is at rest." She sat beside Caleb's fire. "He told me last night that he loved me, that he was sorry he could not be everything I needed, and that he was grateful I found you. Then he made me promise to be happy." "We will be happy," Caleb said. "When you are ready, no rush." Sarah looked at him with those direct brown eyes. "I am grieving my husband, but I am also feeling free for the first time in my adult life. That probably makes me a terrible person." "It makes you human." Caleb took her hand carefully. "Grieve him, honor him, but do not punish yourself for also feeling relief that you can now choose your own path. Will you wait for me while I figure out how to do this? I will wait as long as you need." Sarah squeezed his hand. "Thank you. For everything. For saving him when he was injured, for helping us on this journey, for being patient with me, for learning to live again so I could learn too." They sat together until Sarah had to return to her children, to the practical necessities of continuing the journey without a husband. The wagon train rolled on the next day, one grave lighter, carrying the living toward their future. Caleb drove the Fletcher wagon for the rest of the journey. Emma and Jack rode on the seat beside him, slowly recovering from their grief, asking him questions about the country they passed through. Sarah walked beside the wagon often, needing the physical activity to process her emotions. Other women from the train would join her, offering comfort and companionship. The trail wound through Idaho and into Oregon territory. They crossed the Snake River, climbed more mountains, descended into valleys that grew greener and more lush. The land changed, becoming more welcoming, more fertile. They could see why people dreamed of Oregon, why they risked everything to reach it. In mid-September, nearly 4 months after leaving Fort Bridger, the wagon train rolled into the Willamette Valley. The valley spread before them, green and golden, dotted with homesteads and small settlements. This was the promised land, the destination that thousands had died trying to reach. Peterson led them to Oregon City, the official end of the trail. Families dispersed, some staying in town, others heading out to claim land under the Homestead Act. The Fletcher wagon rolled to a stop, and Sarah stood looking at the town with tears in her eyes. "We made it," she whispered. "Thomas wanted us to reach Oregon, and we made it." "He would be proud," Caleb said. Sarah turned to him. "What happens now?" It was a question with many layers. What happened to them, to their growing love, to the future they might build? Caleb climbed down from the wagon and stood before her, this woman who had saved him with wildflowers and faith. "Now we decide what we want," he said. "You need time to grieve properly, to settle, to figure out who you are as a widow with children. I need to find work, to establish myself here, to prove I can live in civilization again. And then, if you are willing, we court properly. We let Emma and Jack get used to the idea. We build something real and lasting." Sarah smiled through her tears. "That sounds like a good plan. And after a proper amount of time, if you still want me, I will ask you to marry me." "I will say yes," Sarah said. "But you are right. We should do this properly, for the children's sake and for our own." Caleb wanted to kiss her, wanted to pull her into his arms and never let go. But they were in the middle of town, surrounded by the wagon train families, and Sarah deserved respect and propriety. "I will find a place to stay," he said. "Then I will help you find land, build you a house. I will be around whenever you need me." "I know you will. Sarah reached out and touched his face gently. "Thank you, Caleb Thorne, for saving me, for saving all of us." The next 6 months were a flurry of activity. Sarah filed a land claim under the Homestead Act, getting 160 acres of good valley land with timber and a creek. Caleb took work with a logging outfit, using his massive strength to earn wages and establish himself. With his earnings and help from other settlers, they built Sarah a cabin, a solid structure with 2 rooms and a good fireplace. Caleb got his own small place a few miles away, but he spent most of his time at Sarah's land, helping with the heavy work, teaching Jack how to hunt and fish, reading to Emma in the evenings. The children grew attached to him, and he to them. Sarah bloomed in Oregon, building a home and a life with an energy that had been suppressed during her marriage. They courted in the old-fashioned way. Caleb would visit formally, bringing gifts, sitting in her parlor and talking while the children played. They would walk together, always properly chaperoned by Emma and Jack. They went to community gatherings, to church, to barn raisings. People accepted them, this widow and the mountain man who had brought her safely to Oregon. 6 months after arriving in the valley, on a spring day when wildflowers bloomed across the meadows, Caleb asked Sarah to marry him. He did it properly, with Emma and Jack present, asking for their blessing as well as Sarah's. "I love your mother," he told the children, "and I love both of you. I will never try to replace your father, but I would like to be a father to you in my own way. I would like us to be a family. What do you think?" Emma, now 9 years old, looked at him seriously. "Will you teach me to track like you promised?" "I will." "And will you keep reading to us at night?" Jack asked. "Every night." The children looked at each other, then nodded. "Then you should marry Mama," Emma declared. Caleb turned to Sarah, who was crying and laughing at the same time. "What do you say? Will you marry me, Sarah Fletcher? Will you let me spend the rest of my life proving I can be the man you and the children deserve?" "Yes," Sarah said without hesitation. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." They were married in June of 1876, a year after Sarah had first put wildflowers on Caleb's table. The whole community turned out for the wedding. Sarah wore a dress she made herself, cream-colored with wildflowers embroidered on the collar. Caleb wore new clothes that felt strange after years in buckskins, but he did it for her. Emma and Jack stood up with them, part of the ceremony, as they joined together to become a family. When the minister said Caleb could kiss his bride, he did so gently, reverently, this woman who had brought him back to life. The wedding party lasted all day, with food and dancing and celebration. Caleb danced with his new wife, with Emma, even with some of the other women from the community who insisted. He was awkward and uncomfortable with the attention, but he was also happy in a way he had never expected to be again. That night, in the cabin they would now share, Sarah lit candles and put fresh wildflowers on the table. Caleb saw them and smiled. "You are still putting flowers on my table," he said. "Always," Sarah replied. "They remind us both to see beauty, to choose life, to be grateful for second chances." Caleb pulled her into his arms, marveling that she was his now, that he got to keep her. "I love you, Sarah Thorne. I love you too, my mountain man, my gentle giant, my second chance." They built a good life together in the Willamette Valley. Caleb worked their land and hired out for logging when they needed extra money. Sarah planted a garden that became legendary in the area for its size and productivity. Emma and Jack thrived, growing strong and happy with Caleb as their father in all the ways that mattered. 2 years after they married, Sarah gave birth to a boy they named Thomas, after the man who had brought them together. Caleb held his son for the first time and cried, this huge mountain man weeping over a tiny baby, overwhelmed by love and gratitude. "Thomas would be so happy," Sarah said, watching her husband with their child. "He gave us this," Caleb said, "all of this. He is the reason we found each other." They had 2 more children over the next years, another boy named Caleb Jr. and a girl named Rose, after Sarah's favorite flower. The house expanded, rooms added to accommodate their growing family. Emma grew up and married a good man from a neighboring farm. Jack became a surveyor, mapping the Oregon Territory. The younger children filled the house with noise and chaos and love. Caleb never completely lost the darkness that had almost destroyed him. Some nights it would press in, whispering its old familiar poison. But now he had Sarah to pull him back, to remind him he was good and loved and worthy. He had children who needed him, land that required his care, a community that valued him. The darkness could not survive against so much light. He still kept Sarah's pressed flower book, the one she had given him years ago. Sometimes he would take it out and look through the pages, remembering the man he had been when she first put wildflowers on his table. That man had been barely alive, drowning in trauma and isolation. This man, the one Sarah had helped him become, was fully alive and grateful for every day. 20 years after they married, Caleb and Sarah sat on their porch watching the sunset. Emma was visiting with her own children. Jack was coming for supper with his wife. The younger children were playing in the yard. The land they had built together stretched around them, golden with late summer light. "Do you ever regret it?" Caleb asked. "Leaving Pennsylvania, the hard journey, losing Thomas so young?" "Never," Sarah said firmly. "Thomas gave me the greatest gift by bringing me west, and by loving me enough to let me find you. Every hard moment was worth it to get to this. I think about that day sometimes. When you walked into my camp with your family, I almost sent you away. I am glad you did not." Sarah squeezed his hand. "You saved us, Caleb, and we saved you right back." "You saved me first," Caleb corrected, with wildflowers on a table. "That was the moment everything changed." Sarah laughed. "Such a small thing to make such a big difference." "The best things usually are." They sat in comfortable silence, watching the sun sink behind the mountains, counting their blessings and remembering their journey. Two people who had found each other against all odds, who had built something beautiful from tragedy and second chances. Inside the house, on the table where they gathered for every meal, fresh wildflowers bloomed in a vase. They always would, as long as Sarah and Caleb lived. A reminder of where they started, of what they had overcome, of the moment when a mountain man felt the darkness finally leave his mind. The years continued to pass in the gentle rhythm of their Oregon life, marked by seasons and harvests, births and celebrations. Caleb's transformation from the isolated mountain man to the patriarch of a thriving family was complete. He became known throughout the Willamette Valley as a man of integrity, someone you could count on when times were hard, someone whose word was his bond. He never forgot the darkness, but he learned to live with it, to acknowledge it without letting it control him. Sometimes on hard days, Sarah would find him standing in their meadow, surrounded by wildflowers, breathing deeply and remembering how to hope. She would join him silently, taking his hand, lending him her strength until the shadow passed. Emma's children called him Grandpa Caleb and would beg for stories about his mountain days and the journey west. He would tell them edited versions, leaving out the worst of the violence and trauma, focusing instead on the beauty of the high country, the excitement of scouting for the wagon train, the day their grandmother put flowers on his table and changed his life. Jack followed in his father's footsteps in many ways, becoming a skilled outdoorsman and surveyor. He would take Caleb Jr. and Rose into the mountains, teaching them tracking and survival, passing on the skills Caleb had taught him. The younger children grew up confident and capable, secure in the love of parents who had fought hard for their happiness. Thomas, their firstborn son together, grew into a thoughtful young man with his namesake's generous spirit and Caleb's physical strength. He would often ask about the father he had never known, the man who had given him his name. "Tell me about my namesake," Thomas would ask, and Caleb would sit with him and share stories about Thomas Fletcher's courage, his sacrifice, his extraordinary love for Sarah and the children. "He was the bravest man I ever knew," Caleb would say. "Not because he fought in battles or survived in the wilderness, because he loved your mother enough to let her go, to give her permission to be happy after he was gone. That takes a different kind of courage." "I hope I can be like him," young Thomas would say. "You already are," Caleb would assure him. The house they built together became a gathering place for the community. Sarah's generous spirit and Caleb's steady presence drew people to them. They hosted barn raisings and harvest celebrations. They took in travelers who needed shelter. They helped new families get established, drawing on their own experience of arriving in Oregon with nothing but hope and determination. Caleb often thought about Peterson, the wagon master who had hired him all those years ago. The man had died a few years back, but before he passed, he had visited the Thorne homestead and told Caleb he was proud of how he had turned out. "You were running from something when you joined my train," Peterson had said. "But somewhere along the way, you stopped running and started living. That is the best any of us can do." On their 25th wedding anniversary, their children threw them a party that brought together seemingly half the valley. People came from miles around to celebrate the couple who had become pillars of their community. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, stories and toasts. Emma stood up to speak. Her own children gathered around her. "My father, Thomas Fletcher, brought us west seeking a better life. He found that life for us, even though he could not stay to enjoy it. And then Caleb Thorne came into our lives and became the father who raised us, who loved us, who showed us what a good man looks like. Both men gave us everything. Both men were our fathers. And our mother, Sarah, was strong enough and brave enough to love them both and to build something beautiful from tragedy. We are blessed beyond measure." Jack spoke next, his voice rough with emotion. "Caleb taught me that strength is not just about physical power. It is about showing up every day, doing the right thing even when it is hard, loving fiercely, and never giving up on the people who matter. He is the best man I know, and I am honored to call him Pa." Caleb, sitting with Sarah's hand in his, felt his throat tighten with emotion. These children who had been so small and scared on the trail west were now adults with families of their own. He had helped shape them, had given them his name and his love, and they had given him purpose and joy. When it was his turn to speak, Caleb stood and looked around at the crowd. So many faces, so many friends, so much life. It was overwhelming for a man who had once thought he would die alone in a mountain cabin. "I do not have fancy words," he began, "but I want to say this. 26 years ago, I was a dead man walking. The war and the years after broke something in me. I hid in the mountains because I could not face life anymore. Then Sarah Fletcher put Wildflowers on my table, and for the first time in years, I noticed something beautiful. That small act of grace changed everything." He looked at Sarah, who was crying quietly. "My wife saved me, not by trying to fix me or change me, but just by seeing good in me when I could not see it myself. She taught me that beauty matters, that hope matters, that love matters. Everything I am, everything we have built, starts with her and those wildflowers." The crowd applauded, but Caleb was not done. "Thomas Fletcher was a better man than I will ever be. He loved Sarah and Emma and Jack so much that he wanted them to be happy even after he was gone. He gave me the gift of this family, and I have tried every day to be worthy of that trust. I hope he knows wherever he is that I kept my promise, that I loved them and cared for them and did my best." He sat down to thunderous applause, and Sarah threw her arms around him, holding tight. "You kept your promise," she whispered in his ear. "You exceeded it. You are everything I ever needed and more." The party continued late into the night, with dancing and stories and celebration. Caleb danced with Sarah, with Emma, with Rose, with seemingly every woman there. His stiff formality from years ago had softened into something warmer, more relaxed. He would never be entirely comfortable in crowds, but he no longer needed to run from them. As the night wound down and guests started heading home, Caleb and Sarah walked through their land, just the two of them, enjoying the cool night air. The moon was full, casting silver light across their fields and meadows. 25 years, Sarah mused. It feels like both forever and no time at all. "Best 25 years of my life," Caleb said, "even counting the hard parts, the droughts and the bad winters and the times when money was tight. Especially counting those parts. They taught us what we were made of." He stopped and pulled her close. "I love you, Sarah Thorne. I loved you when you were Sarah Fletcher putting flowers on my table. I loved you on the trail west. I loved you when we married, and I love you more now than I did then, which I did not think was possible. I love you too, my mountain man, my gentle giant, my greatest blessing." She stretched up and kissed him, sweet and lingering. "Thank you for choosing life instead of darkness. Thank you for taking a chance on a widow with 2 children and a head full of dreams. Thank you for seeing a man instead of a monster, for giving me reasons to live." They walked back to their house, arms around each other, hearts full. Inside, the table held fresh wildflowers like always. yellow and purple and white blooms that glowed in the lamplight. Caleb paused to look at them, as he did every day, remembering. The darkness that had once consumed him was nothing but a distant memory now, a shadow that occasionally whispered but no longer controlled. In its place was light and love and family, was a wife who made him laugh and children who called him Pa, was a community that respected him and land that sustained them, was a life so full and rich that sometimes he could hardly believe it was real. But it was real. Every moment of it was real and earned and precious. He had survived the war, survived the aftermath, survived the darkness, and on the other side of all that surviving, he had found Sarah and learned to truly live. As they prepared for bed that night, Sarah put her arms around Caleb's waist and rested her head against his broad chest. "What are you thinking about?" "About how different my life is from what I expected. About how I thought I would die alone in those mountains. About how I was wrong." "I'm glad you were wrong." "Me too." He kissed the top of her head. "So very glad." They lay down together in the bed they had shared for 25 years, comfortable and familiar, still deeply in love. Outside, the Oregon night was peaceful and star-filled. Inside, wildflowers graced their table, a promise kept, a symbol of beauty and hope and second chances. Caleb Thorne, the mountain man who had felt the darkness finally leave his mind, closed his eyes and smiled. He was home. He was loved. He was exactly where he was supposed to be. And somewhere, he hoped, Thomas Fletcher was smiling too, knowing his sacrifice had created something beautiful, knowing his children were cared for, knowing Sarah had found the great love she deserved. The story that began with wildflowers on a table had grown into a lifetime of love, a legacy of family, a testament to the healing power of human connection. It was a story of darkness defeated by light, of loneliness transformed into belonging, of survival becoming truly living. It was their story, and it was beautiful. It was